Everybody, I wanted to talk about a subject that I find kind of interesting, actually, and I've been thinking about it a lot the last few weeks, and that is the subject of Eric Clapton and the Fender Telecaster. You know, Clapton's associated with so many great guitars, particularly obviously the Strat, since the mid 70s or so. He's sort of like Mr. Stratocaster, you know, one of a handful of people you really associate with the Fender Strat. But before that, he played a bunch of great guitars, a lot of Gibsons. You know, he was associated with the Gibson Firebird, the Gibson SG, the Gibson ES335, the Gibson Les Paul. He did the Blues Breakers album on the Gibson Les Paul, which is probably one of the greatest guitar albums ever made. But there are really only two parts of his career where he played a Telecaster in a significant way, I would say. You can correct me if I'm wrong. One of them is in the Yardbirds. He played a 1962 Telecaster, which was actually the property of the Yardbirds. And that he doesn't seem to mention it much in here. I find it interesting that he played this guitar. Today, that red Telecaster is sort of famous, if for no other reason than it was Eric Clapton Yardbird's guitar. But he doesn't say much about it in here. And the other time in his career where he was associated with the Strat was in Blind Faith, particularly at that concert at Hyde Park where he played a Telecaster body, which I think was a 62 or 63 custom Telecaster, and he put the neck of Brownie on that Telecaster. So it's kind of a mutt or a hybrid. I don't know if that's a parts caster, but it was a Telecaster body and a Stratocaster neck. Those are the only two times I can really think of where he's really been sort of associated with the Telecaster. And I don't know if that's accurate. And, I'm sure with a guitar collection like he has, he's got Telecasters around the house. In fact, I actually Googled a Google search, Eric Clapton and the Telecaster, and an auction that happened about 15 years ago came up where he was selling a lot of his guitars. I don't think he was trying to raise money for his rehab center. It wasn't one of the auctions where they were selling like the really famous, iconic guitars, but just like some of the guitars he had in his home. And what I noticed, you had several dozen guitars and only a couple Telecasters. And some of the comments said that, about the Telecasters were there. He said he never really incorporated the Telecaster into his live shows, which was kind of interesting. But the one guitar I thought was worth noting on that auction was a 1952 Blackguard Tele, Butterscotch Blonde Tele, that was given to him by Carl Rattle. And that sold for $100,000. There's a lot of sentimental value there, plus it's a 52 Fender Telecaster, so it's a vintage instrument anyway. And it said it meant a lot to Eric Clapton. But what I find interesting is he doesn't really seem very associated with the Telecaster. Both those, him playing the Yardbirds Telecaster and then him playing the Telecaster with Blind Faith, those were kind of blips on the radar screen. And I also notice in this book, he doesn't say much about the Telecaster. Now, I'm going to embarrass myself and put on my wife's reading glasses. They were $1 at the Walmart, $1. And I liked them better than my $400 prescription lenses. But in here, he talks a little bit about that red Yardbirds Telecaster, and he doesn't even mention it by name. So in this book, I wish he'd actually talk more about his guitars. This book to me could have been twice as long, and I would have enjoyed it. But anyway, but he does at several points talk about the guitars he's played and how much he loved ones. But I noticed he doesn't say anything about that red Telecaster. The only thing he says is that the guitar, he put light gauge strings on it so he could bend strings. Apparently that was quite the rage in England in 1964 or 63, bending strings. That was sort of a new frontier of music. Tells you how much things have changed. But he put light gauge strings on it, and all he says here is, on my guitar, I use light gauge guitar strings. So he doesn't even say what kind of guitar it was. He doesn't say I had this red Telecaster, it was this kind of guitar. I liked it. I didn't like it. All he says is I use light gauge guitar strings with the very thin first string, which made it easier to bend the notes. And it was not uncommon during the most frenetic bits of playing for me to break at least one string. During the pause while I was changing my string, the frenzied audience would often break into a slow hand clap, inspiring Giorgio, he was, I think, the manager of the Yardbirds, to dream up the nickname of Slow Hand Clapton. That's the only thing he really says about that red I guess the red Telecaster was what gave him his nickname, so maybe that's kind of, but Slow Hand. So when he would break strings and he would stand up there changing strings on stage, and the audience would start to slow clap while waiting for him to change strings. By the way, how great does that live music scene sound? Just all these enthusiastic, and in a bar or so, that was in a bar or a pub or some kind of small theater at the largest. People would clap. That's got to be great. Great time to see Clapton. But it's interesting, he doesn't even mention that guitar. He doesn't even mention it. The other thing, now over here, the next page, he has a little section of his autobiography where he meets about George Harrison, and he said he'd never met George Harrison before, and he kind of goes through, that this would become a great friendship, and he liked George. He kind of goes through that right away. But he says they talked about George's Gretsch guitar, and then Eric Clapton showed him how he used light gauge strings to bend strings. But that's all he said is, we talked shop a lot. George showed me his collection of Gretsch guitars, and I showed him my light gauge strings, which I always bought from a shop called Clifford Essex on Earlham Street. So he doesn't even mention this Telecaster. Doesn't even mention it, which is sort of interesting. Maybe that red Telecaster wasn't that good. As a matter of fact, in this book, this is another book, Tony Bacon, The History of the Telecaster Guitar. It's a history of the Telecaster. It's a pretty good book. I should review it sometime. But in here they talk a little bit about that red guitar. And that when Eric Clapton left the Yardbirds, that red guitar was the property of the Yardbirds, so it passed on to Jeff Beck, who replaced Eric Clapton. So Jeff Beck played it for a while. And Jeff Beck said he couldn't wait to replace that guitar. Said, I'd already sold my first Fender Strat, but here's what he said, I got rid of the red Telly. It was a terrible guitar. So Clapton, I would say, damns that red Telecaster with faint praise, as we might sometimes say. If you're ever writing a letter of recommendation, you can damn with faint praise. If you can't say anything bad, just don't say anything good, and that's kind of damning with faint praise. I would say in his autobiography, Clapton sort of criticizes with faint praise. He doesn't say anything about that red Telly, but Jeff Beck, a little more impolitic, just comes out and says it was a terrible guitar, which is kind of interesting. Now, just to kind of fill that story, so Jeff Beck got a guy named John Owen to give him a white Telecaster, which was in 1959, and this is a replica of that guitar. So this guitar, which is today sold in a replica form, is the Jimmy Page Mirror Telecaster. Jimmy Page light show. How's my hair? You know what? You can comb your hair in this guitar. But this is that white Telecaster that replaced the red Telecaster. So this great guitar, which is such a great guitar, which was ended up being on some of the Jeff Beck Yardbird stuff, and also was on all the Jimmy Page Yardbird stuff, and the so this guitar, Jeff Beck picked up this guitar and ended up giving it to Jimmy Page when Jimmy Page, because he was so grateful for having been let into the Yardbirds. So this guitar went from being Jeff Beck's guitar to Jimmy Page's guitar, or the one that this is based on. But this guitar was a replacement for Jeff Beck for that red guitar. So the red Fender Telecaster doesn't seem to have gotten very much favorable press. The other thing, by inference, it implies that he didn't really like that Telecaster, because in the period when he was playing the red Telecaster in the Yardbirds, he said that was the first time he started making decent money. He wasn't rich yet, I think he got rich with Cream, and has been rich ever since. But he was starting to make some money, and the first thing he did was buy a Gibson ES335. So it's kind of interesting. So he's playing a Fender Telecaster, and he couldn't wait to get his hands on a Gibson ES335. Listen to, and he kind of by extrapolation, I would say he's kind of criticizing the Tele, at least the one he was playing. He says, though the Yardbirds weren't yet in the big money league, we were making enough for me to buy my first really serious guitar, a cherry red Gibson ES335, the instrument of my dreams. Right? Listen what he says up here. When I finally bought the Gibson, I just couldn't believe how shiny and beautiful it was. At last, I felt like a real musician. So, again, he is playing a red Telecaster, 1962 red Telecaster, and he made it sound, I would kind of say, if you kind of read between the lines, he felt like that red Tele was kind of a toy or a cheap something or another compared to the Gibson ES335, which would become his iconic Gibson ES335. So it's just sort of an interesting observation I have, that he doesn't ever seem to have played Telecasters much, and he certainly has played a lot of other great guitars. Now, the other major time I see Eric Clapton playing Telecasters that I can think of, correct me if I'm wrong, or if you know of other times, not just maybe he was sitting around the house playing a Tele while he was watching football or something, but I mean like really, making it a significant part of his music and his performances in particular. But the other time is at the Blind Faith concert, and that's an iconic one. But he doesn't seem to... Now, he says some bad things about that Hyde Park concert. He didn't like it at all. I love watching it. Let's see. Now, he says some things about that Hyde Park concert where he played the Tele, and that was a Telecaster body with the Strat neck. And again, what I find interesting is he doesn't mention the guitar. So he had the neck of Brownie on that guitar. So the neck of the Brownie guitar, which would end up being on Layla and Let It Rain, and all those great songs, was at this Hyde Park concert. Now, he doesn't mention that guitar by name, but he really criticizes the sound system He said I didn't really want to be there. It wasn't helped by the fact that we were completely underpowered. We didn't have enough amplification for playing outdoors in the park, and we sounded small and tinny. I came off the stage shaking like a leaf and feeling that I'd let people down. So he doesn't mention the Telecaster. He's not blaming the Telecaster. In fact, if you read this book, he actually blames Ginger Baker for that. I like that show. I watch it, and it's great. It's kind of like a time capsule of 1969 in London. But it's interesting again that we always talk about that Telecaster and Blind Faith, but he doesn't ever say much about it. And Fender came out with the custom shop reissue of that guitar. I would love that guitar, by the way, but it was $10,000, so no way. But I noticed when Clapton was talking about it, when Fender kind of presented him with it, and they were kind of marketing it maybe a little bit. This Blind Faith Eric Clapton Telecaster Stratocaster hybrid. Clapton made some comment like, "Well, you can never really open up on a Tele." And then I noticed when they cut back to the Fender shop to kind of talk about how they made the guitar, he said something like, "Just to clarify, Eric Clapton does love Telecasters." And now I went to look for that clip again in YouTube to put in this video, and I could not find it. So I'm thinking Clapton sort of implied in that clip that he didn't ever like Telecasters that much, and Fender took it out because they were marketing this Eric Clapton Telecaster. I don't know that. But it's interesting, he doesn't ever mention the Telecaster in these books, and I've never really associated him with the Telecaster. You know what? And there's there's a website, Eric Clapton and the Telecaster, and I imagine there are a lot of Telecasters on his albums. When he was with George Terry, they had some really creative use of guitars, and I think that George Terry, who played on all those great 1970s albums, he was always one to play a lot of different guitars. But in here, he actually says, but I do find it kind of interesting that the one guitar you never see Eric Clapton really closely associated with is the Telecaster. Sure, he's associated with the Strat, but he's also, if you think about it, he's very closely associated with the ES335, the Gibson SG, the Gibson Les Paul, and also the Gibson Firebird and some other Gibsons. The one guitar I really don't ever see referenced much with Eric Clapton, other than those two examples I gave of the Yardbirds and some in Blind Faith. I don't think he played that guitar all that much in Blind Faith. Those are the only two times he ever played the Telecaster much. So I don't know. How can you not like a Telecaster? I mean, I'm sure if you stuck a great Telecaster in his hands, he'd love it and everything. And who wouldn't? Any guitar player loves a nice Telecaster. So I'm not saying he doesn't like them or something, but I just kind of find it interesting that of all the great guitars he's played and sort of made part of his identity, even beyond the Strat, one of them is not the Fender Telecaster. And as a big Telecaster fan, that's sort of weird to notice. And I don't know, maybe it's just a sort of a fluke. He just never ended up playing them on stage that much. And he loves Telecasters and plays them all the time on his albums or at home or with his friends or whatever. I don't know. But it's just sort of a simple fact that he really isn't that associated with the Telecaster, either sort of in popular culture or on a lot of his iconic periods, So it's an interesting thing to think about. Thanks. God bless.